Joining me now, our team of reporters here, Vaughn Hillyard outside the White House, Keir Simmons in Moscow, and Courtney Kube is outside the Pentagon for us. So, Vaughn, we'll start with you here. Is everything at a standstill right now until Zelenskyy apologizes? And if that happens, do they feel like the U.S.-Ukraine relationship can be repaired?
Right. There's no indication that negotiations have opened back up between the U.S. and Ukraine, and White House officials have been explicit that they have cut off negotiations with Ukraine after Friday's Oval Office meltdown, the exchange that led to ultimately Volodymyr Zelenskyy flying to London for that major summit there, and Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, and French President Emmanuel Macron announcing that they are going to now be the ones initiating peace talks in a draft proposal of what a potential peace agreement could look like. And then at that point, they will then deliver it for the United States to review, suggesting that the U.S. is still going to be key toward a long-term solution, a ceasefire, and end to this war and Russian aggression against Ukraine. But we have heard from President Trump here just in the last hour, openly suggesting that he wants to hear from Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president, that he appreciates what the U.S. has offered it over the course of its last 3 years of war. And as you just heard there from National Security Michael Waltz, there is skepticism about the ability to bring both Russia and Ukraine back here to the negotiating table. And President Trump responded this afternoon to the suggestion from President Zelenskyy that this war take a long time. You heard from President Trump explicitly say that that should not be the case. It looks like we may be a ways away from these two sides beginning those talks again.
And Vaughn, I'm curious, what's the reaction within the administration to this summit that European and NATO leaders held over the weekend without the U.S.?
Right. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, suggested that he had a phone conversation with President Trump in which he told him about this effort that European leaders are going to take with Zelenskyy to put forward their own plan, and that he would keep him apprised. He said, well, Europe will do the heavy lifting. He said that the U.S.'s involvement will be imperative, and the financial and military aid that the U.S. will hopefully, and for them, continue to provide is going to be crucial. And we saw late last night, that's where you saw President Zelenskyy, after that summit with those Western leaders, come and talk to reporters for 90 minutes, in which he did articulate that he is ready to sign a critical minerals deal with the United States if the United States is ready. But we are almost 24 hours since that moment, and there has been no agreement signed.
All right, Vaughn Hillyard for us here in Washington. Vaughn, thank you. Let's turn to Keir Simmons now in Russia. Keir, what's the reaction from the Kremlin been to this rift in the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine?
Well, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, in telling reporters here in Moscow, quote, "We see the collective West has begun to partially lose its unity," calling it a fragmentation. A envoy for Russia, newly appointed, posting a video of the exchange between President Zelenskyy and President Trump in the Oval Office on Friday, and simply saying on X, historic, a very popular anchor here in Russia, declaring that President Trump behaved stoically. So taken as a whole, the Russians think, frankly, that they are winning. They believe that there is a gap now truly opening up between Europe and the United States. It is clear, frankly, that NATO is on the precipice of a crisis, and President Trump's aim to get to a ceasefire quickly, promised to the American people, right now looks very difficult. The Russians say, and the Foreign Office spokesman here, woman here saying this, that they want a ceasefire, but only if the West addresses their fundamental concerns, like the expansion of NATO. The Ukrainians say they want a ceasefire, but only if they get cast iron guarantees that there won't be further attacks by Russia, that they'll be protected, and neither of those two positions look like delivering for President Trump the kind of ceasefire that he has demanded, that he wants, and that he's told the American people he can deliver.
So, Keir, as we look at this rift, as we say, between these two countries, or at least between these two presidents right now, do you get the sense that this will embolden President Putin, that we can see him take a more aggressive stance against the West or on the battlefield against Ukraine?
Well, I think that's one of the ironies of it, Aaron, is that if indeed the Trump administration decides to pull support for Ukraine, it might make a ceasefire less likely, because inevitably President Putin here in Moscow is going to think, well, that's going to make my chances on the battlefield greater, and may well believe. And keep in mind, Russia has, for example, 80,000 Russian and North Korean troops near to Kursk here in Russia, for example. Putin may well think that he should keep going, at least for some months. Another aspect of all of this, Russian officials are saying that normalization with the United States could happen quickly. That translates as that the Russians hope that they might get sanctions lifted, some kind of trade with the US re-established, while the question of the war in Ukraine is not addressed. Perhaps the conflict continues. So the Russians very likely think that everything that is happening right now makes their prospects better, and frankly, they'll be pleased with that.
All right, Keir Simmons for us in Moscow today. Keir, thank you. We appreciate it. I want to turn to Courtney Kube now outside the Pentagon. So, Courtney, talk to us a little bit more about this order from Secretary Hegseth on cyber operations. What are the implications here?
Yeah, so this is something that came from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and went to U.S. Cyber Command, and it was ordering them to halt or pause all of their offensive cyber operations against Russia and their offensive information operations against Russia. And as we have just been hearing from Keir and from Vaughn and from you, the timing of this is why there are so many people who are concerned about this decision. Now, the U.S. is actively involved in these negotiations. We saw President Trump talking to President Zelenskyy on Friday. We've been talking about that for days. But U.S. officials also met with Russian officials in Riyadh 2 weeks ago. So the U.S. has been actively involved in this attempt to negotiate between Russia and between Ukraine. There are times where it makes sense to change the way your posture or some of your offensive operations during a negotiation. For instance, if this was a more kinetic conflict or war that we were talking about, and the U.S. were to have a ceasefire during a negotiation, that would make sense. In some ways, that is what officials are talking about this. But there are others who are concerned that the opposite should be true, given the situation, that the U.S. should have been stepping up their cyber operations or their information operations on Russia throughout these tense negotiations. And the concern is that as President Trump, as we were just hearing from Keir, President Trump is making it clear that he wants to normalize relations with Russia, with Moscow, more so than we have seen in years, potentially decades, between the U.S. and Russia, that this may be something that is a capitulation to Russia throughout these efforts. Now, the big question now, how long will this go on? And we just don't know the answer to that, Aaron. Is this something that just happens during these active negotiations, or could this be a longer-term situation for U.S. Cyber Command? And at this point, we just don't know the answer yet, Aaron.
All right, we know you'll stay on top of it. Courtney Kube, thank you. And joining me now is Masha Gessen, a Russia and Putin expert and an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Masha, thanks for being here. What's your reaction to how President Trump has handled relations with President Zelenskyy versus how he's handling them with President Putin? What does this mean, do you think, for our standing in the world?
Hi, it's good to be here. Well, I don't know that I have anything terribly original to say on this score. We're seeing Moscow jubilant. They're celebrating splintering the West. Alexander Dugin, who is sort of the self-taught philosopher who feeds Putin a lot of his talking points, has been tweeting or posting on X exuberantly celebrating that, as he says, we're no longer at war with the West. We're not at war with the United States. We're not at war with Hungary. We're not at war with Slovakia. But of course, the biggest win, right, is they're no longer seeing a Western alliance united in defense of Ukraine, united inadequately, I should say, for the last 3 years. There has been a lot of overstatement of the kind of aid that Ukraine has received in the last 3 years, especially from the United States. But still, it was united. It was still helping Ukraine defend itself. And that is no longer the case.
So, as you say, we see the splintering, right? But the Kremlin has been praising President Trump and his recent actions. In a more tangible way, or more specifically, what is Russia seeking to get out of this relationship with the current Trump administration?
I wouldn't actually say that the Kremlin has been praising President Trump. It has been celebrating being able to play President Trump. They're not particularly making a secret of, and Putin has never made a secret of thinking that Trump is a buffoon. And I think they are, they're seeing this, their wildest dreams basically come true. They're able to play this buffoon, as they think, and use his ignorance and his overconfidence to get him to lift sanctions, to get him to seize offensive and possibly, we don't know, defensive operations against Russia, where they're also seeing him decimate the FBI, which also helps Russia proceed with its offensive operations on U.S. soil. And all of this in exchange for absolutely nothing.
You know, in a significant way, we have seen European leaders try to appease President Trump. Both Macron and Starmer announced some additional defense commitments before they visited the White House over the last couple of weeks here. Is that the best strategy for the Europeans, or does there come a point where Europe needs to push back harder on the U.S.?
You know, I can't tell European leaders what to do, and I'm not an expert on that kind of strategy. What I can say is that there's a huge difference between what European leaders have to do and what Zelenskyy has to do. Some people have asked, why hasn't Zelenskyy used a sort of combination of flattery and some advanced concessions to get Trump to be more inclined toward him? Well, he's the president of a country at war. And he also sees Trump being played. And he also sees his overconfidence, which is quite transparent. And he realizes that Ukraine stands to lose absolutely everything because of Trump's overconfidence and because of his conviction that he's a brilliant negotiator. European leaders understand this too, and they understand that Ukraine has functioned as basically a buffer zone between them and an aggressive Russia, and that now is the time to step up and help Ukraine defend itself, because in fact, Ukraine is defending all of Europe, a point that Zelenskyy has made over and over, and which European leaders do hear.
All right, Masha Gessen, we will leave it there for now. We appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.